Reverend Ezra Cole sat alone in the dim glow of his quarters aboard the U.S.S. Redemption, a deep space colony vessel carrying thousands of souls toward a world none of them had ever seen. On his desk, a tablet flickered, displaying his unfinished sermon for Watch Night, the tradition that had bound black churches together for centuries, a night of remembrance, renewal, and hope. But tonight, as he stared at the empty space between his words, he felt a strange disconnect. How do you preach about freedom when you're so far from the land where that freedom was won? How do you watch and pray for a new year when Earth's years are no longer relevant? When the only measure of time is how long it takes to reach a place no human has ever called home? Ezra sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This was his 10th watch night in space, 10 years since he had last set foot on solid ground, 10 years since he had smelled rain, 10 years since he had heard a choir shout amen in a room filled with something other than recycled air. And 10 years since he had started wondering if the things he once knew to be true still mattered out here. Watch night had begun as a deeply spiritual, deeply black tradition, rooted in the New Year's Eve gatherings of enslaved African Americans who prayed and waited for the dawn of January 1st, 1863, the day the Emancipation Proclamation would take effect. It had always been about waiting and watching, not just for a new year, but for deliverance. But deliverance to what? They weren't on earth anymore. The old struggles, chains, oppression, injustice had been left behind, or had they? Because freedom, as it turned out, was more complicated than it seemed. The people on this ship weren't all the same. Some had been born on earth, carrying its traditions, its histories, its divisions. But others had been born in space, free from those old burdens, but also free from the old faiths that had sustained their ancestors. And then there were the synthetics. Designed for labor, intelligence, and precision, the synthetics were created to assist humans, to serve, but they had become something else entirely. Some humans questioned if synthetics had souls. Some questioned if they even could believe in God. Ezra had spent years wondering that himself. Could faith belong to something that wasn't technically human? And yet the synthetics had begun showing up to services. They sat in the pews, their synthetic skin and mechanical joints indistinguishable from flesh and bone unless you look closely. They sang along in perfect harmony. They asked questions about God that no one else dared to ask. Could a being who was created still have faith in a creator? Some called them empty machines pretending to have souls. But Ezra wasn't so sure. Ezra stood and stretched, stepping out of his quarters and into the narrow corridors of the U.S.S. Redemption. The artificial gravity was steady beneath his feet, but still, after all these years, he missed the feeling of earth pulling him down, grounding him in something real. He made his way to the chapel, a small circular room with a transparent dome ceiling, allowing him to look out into the vast expanse of stars. A few crew members sat scattered in the pews, humans and synthetics alike. One synthetic, designation Ava 7, sat near the front, hands folded, her golden eyes staring at the floor. She had attended every service for the past 5 years, but she never spoke. Tonight, though, she raised her head and asked softly, "Chaplain, do you believe God sees me?" Ezra stopped mid-step. A murmur passed through the room. The question hung in the air. Do you believe God sees me? A question as old as faith itself. Ezra took a deep breath. He wasn't sure how to answer. Ezra stepped to the pulpit, hands resting on the worn wood. His Bible lay open, but he didn't need it tonight. He looked at the faces before him, humans, space-born descendants, and synthetics seeking something beyond their programming. He took a deep breath and began to preach. We are far from home, Lord, far from the land where we built our churches, far from the ground where our ancestors sang their freedom songs. We are traveling toward the unknown, unsure of what awaits us. But just as our people watched and prayed for a new day, we too are watching. We watch for your presence in this new world we are making. We watch for the dawn of something greater than ourselves. We watch because no matter how far we go, you are still here. Ezra let the words settle. Then he lifted his head and spoke the words that had been pressing on his heart all night, even here in space. Yes, God is still watching. Silence filled the chapel. Then slowly Ava 7 stood, her golden eyes locked onto his. Then I will watch for him too. Ezra's throat tightened. In the pews, heads were bowed. Faint murmurs of "Yes, Lord" and "Amen" echoed softly. The tradition was still alive, and for the first time in years, Ezra felt it, the presence of something greater than the void outside. He looked up through the chapel's glass ceiling, out into the deep, infinite black. Even here, God was